Morning, folks, and welcome to Great Business Stories. 2001 was Sam Waksal's year. 7 years after discovering Erbitux, the so-called wonder drug, everything seemed to be falling into place. The drug had made it onto the cover of Business Week. Waksal's company, Clone's stock, was at record highs, and he was living like a celebrity. Like, there were photographs of him with Mick Jagger, Lorraine Bracco, Matthew Modine. He was best friends with Martha Stewart. He dated her daughter Alexis for years, and he just sold $111 million worth of shares. To anyone watching, Waksal looked like the golden boy of biotech, a scientist turned successful entrepreneur. But within months, he'd be kicked out of his own company, under federal investigation, and eventually sent to prison, dragging others, most famously Martha Stewart, down with him. But of course, this moment, it didn't come out of nowhere. It started years earlier. And to understand how he got there, we have to go back to the beginning. Sam Waksal was born in Paris, 1947. He was the son of Jewish parents. His mother had survived Auschwitz. His father had fought in the Polish resistance, and by the early 1950s, they'd settled in Dayton, Ohio. And both Sam and his younger brother Harlan, they gravitated towards science. Sam was exceptionally bright. He was, a real proper polymath. He could speak 6 languages, fancied himself as an intellectual, and in many ways, he really was. By 1974, he got his PhD in immunology, and friends back then, they described him as being charismatic, intensely ambitious, and he was absolutely convinced that he was destined to be big in something. Now, with his doctorate in hand, he landed a job at Stanford's famous immunology lab, but trouble started early. It turned out that Waksal had lied about experiments he was running, and he was asked to leave. 1978, he joined the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, and the same pattern happened again. Whenever he was meant to present his findings, there was always some catastrophe, data missing, excuses piling up, and so the NCI decided not to renew his appointment. But Waksal had a lot of charm, and he managed to get a faculty post at Tufts University in Boston around 1980. And as always, at the start, he dazzled his colleagues, and then they began to question the accuracy of his data. Now, around this time, a family scandal erupted because in February 1981, Sam's younger brother Harlan, a qualified doctor, medical researcher, and incredibly close to Sam, he was caught in Florida with more than 2 pounds of cocaine hidden in his clothes. He was charged with possession with intent to distribute, and he was convicted in 1982 and sentenced to 9 years in jail. But on appeal, the case collapsed over an illegal search, so he walked free. Meanwhile, Sam left Tufts again under this cloud of suspicion. Next, Mount Sinai Hospital in New York gave him another fresh start. I mean, he must have been one hell of a charmer how he managed to land these jobs. He ran the immunology lab, recruited a team, and threw himself into work. But in 1985, it all imploded. The details of this were never made public. His file was sealed, but insiders point to, again, falsified data, money irregularities, and disputes over intellectual property. Another exit under a cloud of suspicion. So you can see this pattern forming. Flashes of brilliance because he was brilliant in many ways, followed by self-sabotage. So by now, Waksal was in his late 30s and his academic career was effectively over. So he and Harlan began brainstorming. They wanted to build something of their own, a company in immunology, cancer, infectious diseases, and they called it Clone, short for immunology and cloning. Sam was going to be the CEO, Harlan was his number 2, and on paper, you see, Sam's resume, Stanford, the National Cancer Institute, Tufts, Mount Sinai, it all looked really impressive enough so that investors who didn't know the messy details were going to back him. So they got a bit of venture capital, about $4 million to start. And the pitch was that Clone would be this fully integrated biopharmaceutical startup targeting cancer, AIDS, hepatitis, using new tools in immunology and genetic engineering. And at first, it would act more like a holding company, funding outside scientists' research, with the goal of spinning their work into commercial products. Now, the early projects included diagnostic testing kits for hepatitis B and new vaccine research for infectious disease. And a few of these efforts, they brought in modest revenue, but it was never enough. The company constantly needed funding. So Waksal decided to go public in 1987. But then Black Monday came, the stock market crashed. It had been on a 5-year bull run that came to an end, and as a result, IM-Clone's IPO was pulled. Cash dried up. Waksal had to scramble for private investors. He hustled, and Sam is good at hustling, and he kept the company going. Finally, 1991, IM-Clone made it onto the Nasdaq, and the timing was good. Investors were hungry for biotech stocks. Shares launched at $14, shot up to $27 in early trading, mostly, again, thanks to Waksal's ability to, spin a good story, to make people believe the company was on the verge of a medical breakthrough. He divorced his first wife, his high school sweetheart, by this stage, and as a newly eligible CEO, he, I suppose, cultivated a glamorous social circle. He brought a chic loft in Soho and began hosting these monthly salon parties, wine, art, debate. He loved playing the polymath host. He also dated Alexis Stewart, Martha Stewart's daughter, for 4 years, and through her he became very close to Martha Stewart. He built friendships with wealthy investors, including the irrepressible and the always present Carl Icahn, who makes so many appearances in Great Business Stories. And Icahn later took a stake in IM-Clone and would become a key player in this story. So outwardly, Waksal, he looked every inch the successful biotech millionaire. But in reality, the company was continually cash-strapped and he was leveraged to the hilt. He was constantly juggling creditors. And then, though, in 1994, his hustling, it paid off because IM-Clone licensed this promising antibody from a Dr. John Mendelsohn, a drug called C225, later renamed Erbitux, and it showed early potential in slowing the spread of cancer by blocking certain growth receptors on cells. So by 1995, 2 patients with head and neck cancer in early trials of Erbitux, they showed dramatic responses. Their tumours shrank significantly, and suddenly IM-Clone had something real, something significant. So Waksal, he poured everything into this one drug. Funding was still a constant battle. IM-Clone was, a tiny fish in the big biotech pond, but he was relentless. Like each new data point, each small success, it became part of his pitch. He spun it into another story, another round of funding. And then came the big breakthrough that changed everything. In 1999, a young woman in Florida became the first colon cancer patient to try Erbitux, and the results were really astonishing. Her tumours shrank by more than 80% in a matter of months, and growths that had been the size of grapefruits became operable. So surgeons went in and removed them. Her cancer was essentially in remission. And for IM-Clone, this was huge. Like colon cancer was and is one of the biggest markets in oncology. And if Erbitux could work there, the potential was massive. So larger trials followed with 125 patients, and by mid-2000, the first results from these trials looked very, very promising. That year, Waksal took the stage at ASCO. This is the world's biggest oncology conference. And, with dramatic patient stories and his natural charisma, because Waksal, he is a very charismatic guy. He not only won over oncologists, but he caught Wall Street's eye. He announced that Erbitux is going to be huge, one of the biggest drugs in the history of oncology. And for once, it didn't look like bluster. IM-Clone stock hit $78. In February 2001, IM-Clone received what really was the ultimate validation. The US Food and Drug Administration granted them fast-track status for Erbitux for advanced colon cancer. What that meant was the FDA saw it as a promising therapy for a serious condition and would allow accelerated approval based on ongoing trials. By July, Business Week had put Erbitux on its cover. So, of course, Big Pharma came calling. In September 2001, Bristol Myers Squibb signed a $2 billion partnership deal with IM-Clone. So this was the ultimate validation. And on the back of that deal, Sam and Harlan sold $111 million worth of shares, though they still had plenty more shares, but I couldn't find out exactly how much. And the timing was perfect. On Wall Street, biotech was booming. In New York, Waksal was living like a celebrity. He had a $20 million art collection. He had his name on the social pages. Like, he became exactly what he always wanted to be, a scientist who wasn't confined to the lab, a celebrated entrepreneur with a drug that could change lives, a polymath who held these parties where he impressed guests with his charisma and intelligence. And this is when I first became aware of Waksal, seeing him in these social pages, seeing him in Vanity Fair hanging out with the likes of Martha Stewart. Now, the flip side of all this, though, was that this was the same Sam Waksal who had, flattered to deceive throughout his life. Brilliant, most definitely, but always cutting corners, always dodging rules, ignoring due diligence. As one former colleague put it, cutting corners for Sam was like substance abuse. He did it in every aspect of his life, throughout his entire life. And this pattern would repeat itself again. Because on December 28th, 2001, the FDA released its findings on Erbitux. Waksal maintains that he had been expecting good news, maybe a few last-minute requests for documentation, but essentially he expected to get a green light. Instead, like the FDA, they delivered a hammer blow. Like, not only did they refuse to approve Erbitux, they refused to even review it. Like, this was astonishing. In the FDA's letter, they called IM-Clone's application scientifically incomplete, full of missing data and sloppy documentation. Worse still, the letter said that the pivotal clinical trial wasn't adequate and well controlled. That meant the study's design and execution was so flawed the results couldn't be trusted. In short, the data that was supposed to prove Erbitux worked was useless. And what made all of this even worse was that the FDA had apparently warned Sam about these issues multiple times in meetings, but the company had ploughed on regardless. Waksal said when he got the letter, he said, "I was in shock. I was very disappointed." But what's striking is that he seemed almost oblivious to his own part in it. The man never seemed to learn from his own mistakes. He was always convinced he'd done nothing wrong. It was this blind spot that defines Waksal. And when the markets reopened on December 31st, IM-Clone stock plunged nearly 20% in a single day. Like Waksal, he scrambled to contain the damage. He held a conference call with investors, and he insisted that the problems were purely technical. What he said was, IM-Clone was like, and I quote, "the kid who writes down the answers to his maths problems but doesn't show how he got them." And he promised that approval would still come, maybe later in 2022. But many investors weren't buying it. And they were right, because on January the 4th, the Cancer Letter, this respected industry newsletter, they published excerpts from the FDA's refusal. And the details that they published were brutal. Like, this wasn't about a few missing forms, as Waksal had maintained. The entire study design was fundamentally broken. The FDA's confidence in IM-Clone was gone. And as one analyst put it at the time, the Waksals have probably lost all credibility with the FDA. Hey everyone, a quick update for paying subscribers. Up to now, paying subscribers have had access to a batch of bonus episodes that Keith and I recorded back when Great Business Stories was a co-hosted show. I've now reached the end of that archive, and rather than creating new episodes that would end up diluting the quality of these weekly episodes, I'm pausing subscriptions for now. So if you're a paying subscriber, please download or listen to any bonus episodes you want before the end of December, because the bonus feed will come down at that point. And of course, cancel your subscription. These weekly episodes that you're listening to right now continue exactly as normal. Nothing changes here. This is just about keeping the standard of the weekly episodes as high as possible. Thanks so much for listening and supporting the show. Now let's get back to the episode. At an industry conference in San Francisco that same month, Waksal took the stage, and by now he was hoarse, tired, clearly rattled, and he admitted on stage, he said, "We screwed up." Of course, the fallout was immediate from all this. Peter Peterson, who had co-founded Blackstone, quit the IM-Clone board, having just joined 2 months previously. Angry shareholders filed lawsuits accusing Waksal and his team of misleading investors. But, perhaps most painful of all, really, was the patients with advanced colon cancer. They'd pinned their hopes on Erbitux, and they had obviously and naturally felt betrayed by this. And by early 2002, IM Clone stock had lost almost 70% of its value. Now, Bristol Myers Squibb's, IM Clone's $2 billion partner, they were panicking. They'd bet big on Waksal's vision. And now this was all disintegrating. They tried to push him out as CEO, but the IM Clone board was stacked with Waksal loyalists and they refused. So the feud spilled out into the public, the stock slid further, and day by day the company's credibility just, was eroding. Meanwhile, federal investigators were starting to sniff around. The SEC and the Department of Justice had noticed some very, very strange trading activity in IM Clone shares just before the FDA letter became public on December 28th, because on December 27th, 2001, several major shareholders had suddenly dumped their stock, and among them were members of Waksal's own family and his close friend Martha Stewart. It turned out that Waksal's youngest daughter had quietly sold nearly 40,000 IM Clone shares that day, worth about $2.5 million. And on December 26th, the day before that, Waksal himself had tried to sell $5 million worth of shares from his own account, but his broker refused to execute the trade because of course, insider restrictions. But undeterred, Waksal had tipped off his 75-year-old father, who went on to sell $8 million worth of shares before the FDA's decision became public. It was brazen, but it was also stupid. For a man as intelligent as Waksal, it was astonishing how reckless he could be. So the big question was, how did he know the FDA decision would be so bad? There was no proof of an official tip-off, and I don't believe he got an official tip-off. I think it all just comes down to Sam realising and looking back on his life and knowing. I mean, we talked about a blind spot, but it obviously wasn't that blind a spot. He knew that his submission wasn't great. He knew that the FDA were going to call him out on his sloppiness, on his corner cutting, on his MO. And that's why he rang his family before the results came out. Because some part of him was aware that the news from the FDA might not be good. As the investigation widened, regulators discovered that throughout the 1990s, Waksal had made dozens of unreported stock trades, another clear violation of SEC rules. By May 2002, the pressure had become unbearable. Waksal resigned as CEO and his brother Harlan stepped in. 3 weeks later, at dawn on June 12th, FBI agents showed up at Sam's Manhattan house. Cameras captured the scene, like the once celebrated biotech star being led away in handcuffs, and the charges were pretty damning. Insider trading, obstruction of justice, bank fraud. Prosecutors said he'd even forged signatures to secure a $44 million loan. But what was probably most damning, in my book anyway, was that the criminal complaint revealed that straight after the FDA released their findings on December 28, Waksal, he'd secretly bought put options on IM Clone stock through a Swiss account. Essentially, he was betting that his own company's shares would fall. This is a real extraordinary breach of trust. The CEO of a biotech firm secretly wagering on his own failure. And remember, at this very same time, Waksal was reassuring investors that this was all just a big misunderstanding, that they just hadn't crossed their T's and dotted their I's. So it's fair to say when the details of these investigations became known, Waksal's goose was cooked. By October 2002, he pleaded guilty to securities fraud, perjury and obstruction of justice. His downfall dragged others into the storm too. In 2003, Martha Stewart was indicted on 5 counts related to her IM Clone stock sale. Now, her trial, of course, became the tabloid focus. Waksal didn't tip Stewart off directly. Her broker, who was also Waksal's, had called Stewart after seeing the Waksal family dump their shares. Now, Stewart's net worth at that time was about $650 million, and the trade that triggered everything had saved her just $45,000. Now, it's also important to point out Stewart wasn't convicted of insider trading. Instead, she was found guilty of making false statements and obstructing justice. In July 2004, she was sentenced to 5 months in federal prison and 2 years of supervised release, including 5 months of electronic monitoring. Now, we got to remember that at that time, Stewart was without doubt one of the most admired and celebrated entrepreneurs in the US. So, this was a huge, huge fall from grace. And Stewart's is a fascinating story and is one that I will cover in a future episode. But back to Waksal. He'd already pleaded guilty, and on June 10th, 2003, he faced sentencing in a packed courtroom. And the sentence, 7 years and 3 months in prison, a $4.3 million fine, and a $1.2 million in restitution for tax evasion. He was also banned from ever running a public company again. Now, while in prison, Waksal did a lot of reading and reflection. He also wrote 2 novels, a memoir, and a stack of business plans because he vowed, once free, he'd find a way back into biotech. Now, what's really significant, and this is the part I didn't know about the story. I knew all about this, but I didn't know the follow-up. And the follow-up is what's really interesting. Because while Waksal was in jail, Clone kept going. And then in 2004, the FDA finally approved Erbitux. In 2006, one of its biggest shareholders, who I already mentioned, Carl Icahn, he more or less took control. He'd been an early investor in the company. And 2 years later, in 2008, Clone sold to Eli Lilly for $6.5 billion. Icahn owned 14% of the stock, and he made over $400 million in profit. And what's interesting is that he went out of his way to name check and praise Waksal when they made the sale to Eli Lilly. And this is what he said. He said, "While it's easy to hurl stones, all stockholders owe a debt of gratitude to Sam Waksal, without whose dedication and perseverance neither Erbitux nor our great pipeline would exist." And while it's known that Waksal, he still held shares in the company at the time of the sale, I couldn't find out how much he made from that sale. There was a great New York Magazine article at the time that hinted that he'd likely made a lot of money, but when they asked Waksal, he declined to say. So when he was released in 2009, age 61, he was seen in 2 very different lights. To the public, he was the disgraced CEO, a felon, this cautionary tale. But to many people on Wall Street, they quietly acknowledged that for all his flaws, Clone had ultimately been a success, and that Waksal had played a central part in making it one. So that year he launched a company called Cadman, and he got investments from some very big names like Stephen A. Cohen, Daniel Loeb, Ron Burkle, Golden Tree Asset Management. Interestingly, Carl Icahn didn't invest, and I couldn't find out why. Waksal pitched Cadman as a new model, a biotech that could sell drugs while developing them. He said, "Cadman is building a new paradigm, promising to bring medicines to the market faster and cheaper." I mean, in reality, the business model, it wasn't that much different from Clone. The strategy was to find drugs that other companies had abandoned and give them a second chance. Cadman, it became this patchwork of orphaned assets that were glued together by Waksal's conviction that one of them could be a hit. Now, by 2004, the company had a few hundred employees, big R&D costs. Officially, Waksal wasn't CEO. That title went to his brother Harlan, and Sam took the role of Chief of Innovation, Science and Strategy. But in reality, of course, it was still his show. He ran the labs, he cut the deals, he continued to host salon parties in his Soho loft, quoting philosophers over wine while pitching the company's pipeline. By 2016, Cadman was preparing to go public, and for that to happen, Waksal had to step away completely. Because of his conviction, he couldn't serve on any public company. He resigned all formal roles, though not without cushioning his exit. The IPO prospectus revealed that he'd walked away with a severance package worth up to $25 million plus a 12.7% ownership stake. Now, Cadman listed on the New York Stock Exchange that July, raising $75 million at a $800 million valuation. But the stock dropped 20% on its first day because investors were jittery. The company was $218 million in debt. R&D spending was soaring. After the IPO, Cadman cut jobs and shifted his focus to a new drug, KD025, later branded Belumosudil, It was designed for patients aged 12 and over who are suffering from chronic graft versus host disease. In simple terms, this is a brutal condition that can occur after a bone marrow or stem cell transplant when the donor's immune cells attack the recipient's own body. Early trials were promising. Belumosudil showed remarkable responses in patients who had run out of options. And then, in July 2021, the FDA approved it. Under the new name Rezurock, Codman finally had its own proprietary drug on the market, and the payoff was immediate. Within weeks, Sanofi swooped in and bought Cadmon for $1.9 billion. So for Waksal, this wasn't just a big payday. This was vindication. Erbitux hadn't been a fluke. He'd done it again. He found an overlooked drug, recognised its potential, and this time brought it to market properly. No corner cutting this time. So a huge success. And even now, at 77, he's still going. He's the CEO of another biotech company called Graviton. It's hard to know exactly how it's doing, but they've raised some serious funding and have partnered with big players like Sanofi. So Waksal, what do I make of him? Colleagues call him eloquent, charismatic. Critics call him arrogant, deceitful, incapable of learning, although as we can see from his last success, he probably is learning. Just took him a long time to get there. Now, one thing that got my goat when I was researching for this episode was that there was this constant sneering tone, a mocking of his love of art or those salon parties where he'd talk about philosophy. It was very much along the lines of, if you love art, if you love talking philosophy, then you're some sort of pretentious intellectual, you're a tosser. From what I can gather, Waksal, he genuinely loves that stuff. Just because it goes over most of our heads, mine included, I don't think it should be ridiculed first. We don't mock people who love sports or movies, so, let him enjoy what he enjoys. So anyway, getting back to what do I think of Waksal. Yes, he had a long history of carelessness, of cutting corners, of failing to deliver. He even shorted his own company while lying to investors and did plenty of shady stuff when he realised that the FDA wasn't going to approve the drug. And the tragedy is that with Erbitux, he really was on the cusp of a genuine medical breakthrough, and he wrecked it through his inability to do things the right way. Yet, at the same time, he doesn't really fit the mould of a business scammer. The only reason Erbitux eventually made it to the market was because of all of the hustling, the fundraising, the groundwork he'd done, the vision, the persistence, the belief. And then he did it all again with Belumosudil. That's the flip side of Waksal. For all of his flaws, he achieved a lot. 2 successful multi-billion-dollar exits, 2 significant drugs that have had a positive impact on the lives of the patients who use them. That's not a small thing. I think Waksal is probably best summed up by a quote from a friend of his who said, "Sam is not a bad person. He never intentionally goes into something trying to burn or hurt someone. He believes what he tells you, and in his head it's done already. But getting it executed, that doesn't always happen." And look, I know some of you listeners will think I'm being a bit soft on Sam. Maybe I am. Maybe I've been charmed by him. But whatever you think of Sam Waksal, you have to agree, he makes for a great business story. And with that, we get to our listeners' emails. And this one is from Gary. And this isn't a story suggestion. It's some new facts in relation to the Leon Black episode. So Gary points out that the New York Times had a fantastic story on Jeffrey Epstein on October 25th. So this was after the episode that I did on Leon Black was recorded. And in the article, which I've since read, they published very detailed and revealing emails that Epstein wrote to Leon Black. And these emails, they really are something else. I recommend you read them because Epstein is pressuring Black to pay him what he believes he's owed. He's even calling Black's kids retards in it. It's unbelievable. And what's also significant in the article is that it says that notes from a congressional hearing claim that Black paid off 8 women. Now, there's no additional details on who the women were or the paper trail, but this is new material, and if true, then Black is going to be in serious trouble. Let's see how it pans out. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as I have. And remember, if you've got any comments, corrections, or stories you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.